In April 2026, 61-year-old Melissa Gilbert sat down in front of a national television audience and said something almost nobody expected her to say. Her husband had allegedly just been indicted on multiple child sex abuse charges, and instead of staying silent the way her lawyers reportedly told her to, she looked into the camera and defended him completely. But here's what almost nobody remembers while they're watching that clip. This is the same woman who spent her entire childhood being lied to about how her own father actually died. The same woman who hid a 2-bottle-a-night drinking habit behind one of the most wholesome faces in television history. And the same woman who has now openly admitted that the sweet, gentle character audiences fell in love with for 9 straight seasons was never actually who she was. By the time this story reaches its final minute, you'll understand exactly why she says that persona very nearly broke her. So let's go back to the beginning, because almost none of it started the way people assume. Melissa Gilbert's life began in Los Angeles on May 8, 1964, and drama reportedly touched her story before she was even a day old. She was placed for adoption immediately after birth, and adopted the very next day by actor Paul Gilbert and actress and dancer Barbara Crane. Before she could possibly understand what fame even meant, she was already living inside its machinery. That connection ran deeper than most fans ever realized, because her mother's father was Harry Crane, the man credited with creating The Honeymooners, one of the most influential sitcoms in American television history. Melissa didn't grow up somewhere near show business, watching it from a safe distance the way most kids who dream about Hollywood do. She grew up fully inside it, in a household where entertainment wasn't a fantasy chased from afar. It was simply the family trade. That world didn't wait around for her to grow into it. While most toddlers were still learning to string together full sentences, Melissa was already standing in front of a camera. She began working in commercials at a remarkably young age, and one of the earliest best remembered was an Alpo dog food advertisement alongside actress Lauren Green. That detail sounds small now, but it mattered more than people realize, because it meant that for Melissa, childhood and work became tangled together before she ever had the chance to know where one stopped and the other began. There was no real separation between home life and public life for her, and that pressure, the constant sense of being watched and quietly evaluated, settled into her early, and according to her own later accounts, it never fully lifted. But here's the part longtime fans rarely talk about. The hardest chapter of Melissa's childhood wasn't the auditions or the cameras at all. It was a secret sitting quietly inside her own home. For years, she was told her adoptive father had died from a stroke. She carried that explanation with her for a long stretch of her life, repeating it, believing it completely, building an entire version of her own history around it. Then, later on, she learned the actual truth. He had reportedly died by suicide. The revelation didn't just surprise her, it knocked the ground out from underneath her. She has said publicly that she couldn't eat or sleep properly for months afterward, because the grief came flooding back all over again. Except this time it arrived wrapped in betrayal. It wasn't simple loss anymore. It was loss that had allegedly been hidden from her on purpose. And that particular kind of wound, the kind built on a lie you didn't even know you were living inside, doesn't heal the way ordinary grief does. It waits, it resurfaces, and eventually, it forces itself to be dealt with. By the time she uncovered that truth, her home life had already gone through its own upheaval. Her parents divorced when she was 6 years old, and the household reshaped itself again once her mother remarried. New relatives arrived, new rules arrived. A blended family form that looked stable enough from a distance but felt far more complicated once you were actually living inside it every day. From the outside, people saw a smiling child growing up inside a famous, comfortable household. What almost nobody saw was a girl quietly carrying adoption, divorce, hidden grief, and the strange, constant weight of being watched by people who assumed they already knew her entire story. The cheerful image the public consumed never once contained the truth sitting underneath it. And that gap between what the cameras showed and what was actually happening at home would go on to shape nearly everything that came next in her life. Then, in late 1973, everything shifted in a single afternoon. Melissa auditioned for a brand new NBC series called Little House on the Prairie, and the odds were almost impossibly steep. Reportedly, around 500 girls were considered for the role of Laura Ingalls. 500. And out of every single one of them, Melissa was the one who won it. She was only 9 years old when she filmed the pilot, which aired as a television movie on March 30th, 1974. The full series premiered that September, and from that exact moment forward, her entire life took on a completely new shape. Michael Landon, already a major star from his years on Bonanza, reportedly approved her casting personally. He was 37 years old at the time, and on set, he quickly became far more than a co-star to her. He became a mentor, a guide, and in many real ways, a father figure, filling a space that had already been left painfully empty inside her. That relationship would go on to shape nearly every year of her career that followed. From 1974 to 1983, Melissa appeared in almost every single episode of Little House on the Prairie, growing up in real time in front of millions of viewers between the ages of 9 and 18. Her schedule was brutal for a child. Shooting often ran 5 days a week across Simi Valley and various studio sound stages, while school was squeezed into the bare legal minimum of 3 hours a day required for child performers in California. Most 9-year-olds were worrying about spelling tests and recess. Melissa was carrying full emotional scenes in one of NBC's biggest family dramas, watched by tens of millions of Americans every single week. As the show's popularity exploded, her public image locked into place. Michael Landon nicknamed her Half Pint, on screen and off, and audiences fell completely in love with her as the sweet-spirited prairie girl they welcomed into their living rooms week after week. But that adoration carried a hidden cost. Melissa later admitted that playing Laura Ingalls felt, at times, like an escape from her real life. The character gave her somewhere to disappear into, but that same escape slowly turned into a cage. People expected her to be kind, grateful, wholesome, and perfectly behaved, constantly, everywhere, whether the cameras were rolling or not. Fans, and reportedly even some people working alongside her on set, began treating her as though Laura Ingalls wasn't a fictional character at all, but her actual identity. The gap between the sweet child the audience adored and the real girl quietly living through private confusion kept widening year after year. Years later, she would admit this exact tension, the pressure of being loved for a version of herself that didn't fully exist, followed her for the rest of her life. By the time Little House ended in 1983, with follow-up television movies stretching into 1984, Melissa was already a certified teenage icon. She had earned a Golden Globe nomination in 1981 and collected multiple Young Artist Awards along the way. But success never actually answered the deeper question quietly forming underneath all of it. She was famous, she was admired, she was recognized everywhere she went, and yet she still didn't fully know where the character of Laura ended and where Melissa actually began. That question didn't stay behind with childhood. It followed her straight into adulthood, and it would reportedly take her decades to even begin answering it honestly. During the 1980s, Melissa stepped into a world that felt like the polar opposite of the Prairie. She dated Rob Lowe. She spent time around the well-known Brat Pack crowd. She found herself surrounded by Hollywood parties, industry power players, and rock musicians, including Billy Idol. From the outside, it looked like total freedom, the kind of glamorous adult life every former child star supposedly dreams about. But underneath, the picture was far less clean. Melissa later wrote that throughout this entire period, she was still fighting, quietly and constantly, to prove she was more than the child in braids and a bonnet that America had fallen in love with. So she chased grown-up roles, she chased darker roles, she chased riskier material, trying to prove to the industry, and honestly to herself, that she actually had range as an actress, and wasn't simply a nostalgia act frozen in place. That effort showed up clearly in the choices she made. In 1979, while still known across the country as America's Half Pint, 15-year-old Melissa stepped onto a New York stage to play Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker. It was a punishing role, physically demanding, and emotionally raw, asking far more of a teenager than any family television drama ever could. For Melissa, that performance became a kind of proving ground. It showed she could survive difficult, serious material and step fully outside the safe, sunlit world of Walnut Grove. She kept pushing in that direction for years afterward. In the mid-1980s, she deliberately chose television films built around stories far darker than anything Little House fans would have expected from her. In Choices of the Heart in 1983, she played Jean Donovan, one of 4 American churchwomen who were raped and murdered in El Salvador in 1980, a role rooted in real, devastating history. In Blood Vows in 1987, the story of a mafia wife. She stepped into a world filled with crime, fear, betrayal, and violence. These weren't gentle, protective roles chosen to preserve a wholesome public image. They were a deliberate, sustained effort to be seen as a serious actress with real depth, not a permanently frozen child star repeating the same soft image forever. But escaping Laura Ingalls turned out to be far harder than winning the role in the first place had ever been. In the early 1990s, Melissa led 2 different television series as an adult actress, trying hard to build something entirely new. From 1992 to 1993, she starred in the Fox sitcom Stand By Your Man, which lasted 19 episodes before it was canceled. Then she played attorney Kate Delaney in NBC's legal drama Sweet Justice from 1994 to 1995, and that series also ended after just 1 season. On paper, these looked like real opportunities, strong roles, network backing, genuine chances at reinvention. But in reality, the public still saw Laura Ingalls first, before anything else, no matter which character Melissa was actually playing on screen. No new role, however different or demanding, could fully push aside the identity that had made her famous as a child. And by this point, the emotional cost of that gap had been quietly growing heavier for years underneath the surface. In her 2009 memoir, Prairie, Melissa admitted that even decades later, she still felt trapped inside the image that had launched her entire career. She described feeling hollow despite years of public attention and praise, an emptiness fame had never actually been able to fill. She also wrote, with striking honesty, about addiction, about failed relationships, about plastic surgery she came to deeply regret, and about a persistent, gnawing insecurity she felt standing next to what she called Hollywood's beautiful people. That honesty mattered, because it shattered the old illusion completely. The sweet girl America had watched every week on television had grown into a woman quietly dealing with pain, doubt, and a long, difficult search for genuine self-worth that fame had never actually provided. That search became more urgent as her personal struggles deepened underneath the surface. Melissa later explained that her substance problems didn't actually begin during her years on the Little House set, as many people assumed. They started later, in her late 30s, after grief, family stress, and mounting emotional strain all collided at once. After her grandfather died, she began drinking just to help herself sleep at night. Slowly, that habit spiraled into something far more serious, eventually growing severe enough that she was reportedly drinking up to 2 full bottles of wine a night. She has also spoken openly about abusing prescription medication during that same difficult period of her life. One deeply humiliating moment became an unexpected turning point when she passed out drunk in her dog's bed while entertaining a friend inside her own home. The shock and shame of that single moment pushed her toward therapy and toward Alcoholics Anonymous. And around 2004, after years of struggle, she finally reached sobriety. But even sobriety didn't mean her difficulties stopped entirely. Life kept testing her in new ways. Financial trouble followed close behind. By 2015, tax authorities reportedly said she owed roughly $360,000 in back federal income taxes, stacked directly on top of an earlier tax debt, reported in 2013, of around $112,000. At the exact same time, she was trying to piece together a new chapter of her life after years of emotional and financial strain had worn her down. Writing became one of the primary tools she used to rebuild herself from the inside out. When Prairie Tale was released in June 2009, Melissa was 45 years old, and she was finally ready to tear down the polished, perfect image people had carried of her for decades. The memoir wasn't just a life story handed over for public consumption. It was a genuine, deliberate act of honesty aimed directly at the illusion she had spent her whole career performing. Then in 2014, she took a noticeably softer turn with two very different books. Daisy and Josephine was a children's story about a shy girl and her dog, and underneath its gentle surface, it quietly echoed the loneliness that had shaped large parts of Melissa's own childhood. That same year, she also released My Prairie Cookbook, blending more than 80 recipes with behind-the-scenes memories and over 75 scrapbook photos from her Little House years. The book offered warmth, nostalgia, and comfort to longtime fans, but it also revealed something quieter underneath. After years spent inside a tightly controlled Hollywood existence, she still deeply longed for home, for simplicity, and for the messy, imperfect closeness of ordinary family life that fame had never been able to give her. Her public image shifted again as she stepped into an entirely different kind of role, one built on leadership rather than performance. In November 2001, Melissa Gilbert won the presidency of the Screen Actors Guild after a bitter, hard-fought election against Valerie Harper. That victory placed her in a position of real institutional power during an extremely tense period for Hollywood. The union had already endured a 6-month strike in 2000, and the industry was still dealing with fierce disputes over non-union work and overseas production. Melissa was re-elected in 2003 and served until 2005, making her one of the very few former child stars to move from television fame into serious, high-stakes union politics. It was a role that demanded toughness, sharp focus, and the ability to navigate genuine conflict under enormous pressure, qualities that had nothing to do with playing a sweet prairie girl on camera. Melissa Gilbert's relationship with aging didn't shift all at once, in one clean moment of clarity. It happened gradually, in stages, and every single stage left its own mark on her. Long before she was speaking openly about growing older with any real confidence, she was already quietly trying to change the very face the world recognized. Soon after turning 18, she had a rhinoplasty, hoping for a smoother, smaller nose that would look better on camera after years spent growing up in front of a national audience. The first result didn't satisfy her because the tip healed in a way she disliked, so she had it done again. Over time, that first procedure quietly opened the door to others. She later had breast implants, and by the 2000s, she had added fillers, Botox, and a range of other cosmetic treatments, all in an effort to hold on to the kind of look casting directors and agents still described, coldly, as fresh. Looking back now, she has admitted openly that the more she tried to improve her face through these procedures, the more unfamiliar it started to feel, almost like she was slowly becoming a stranger inside her own reflection. That pressure only deepened as she got older. By her 40s, she felt genuinely trapped inside a Hollywood culture where a woman's entire value could shrink down to a number on a dress tag, and to the handful of fine lines that showed up under harsh studio lighting. She is recalled being pushed, both directly and indirectly, to stay around a size 2 or 4 if she wanted to remain competitive in the industry, even after spending nearly her entire life working in that same business. She had started acting at 9 years old. She had carried a full career since childhood, and even so, the demand never eased. It stayed exactly the same, decade after decade. After her 2011 divorce, that pressure became even more personal and relentless. What had once felt like occasional maintenance slowly turned into constant routine upkeep. Botox, fillers, laser treatments, and hair dye became a permanent part of her regular cycle, and at some point, she has said, she looked in the mirror and realized the woman staring back looked less like herself and more like someone built entirely out of fear. That realization slowly became a full rejection of the whole system she had spent decades participating in. In interviews years later, especially around 2024 and 2025, Gilbert went directly after the language itself. She said anti-aging was one of her least favorite phrases in the entire industry, because in her own words, anti-aging essentially means dead. For her, that single phrase exposed the entire problem hiding underneath it. It took a completely normal human process and turned it into something shameful, teaching women everywhere to treat every wrinkle as evidence of personal failure. Living in Los Angeles had made that pressure feel absolutely constant, inescapable, built into the air itself. She has described carrying an invisible checklist in her head at all times. No gray roots, no visible lines on camera, no sagging skin, no weight gain, ever. Once she truly saw how much of her life had been quietly shaped by that exhausting, impossible thinking, she wanted out completely. The real break began around 2013. That was the year she finally left Los Angeles behind. She later said plainly that she had to leave the city if she wanted any real chance to age in a natural, human way. Around that same time, after marrying Timothy Busfield, she started making visible, undeniable changes to her life and her appearance. She cut her hair short. She stopped Botox entirely. She stepped away from fillers for good. Then, in 2015, she told fans publicly that she was having her breast implants removed because they were reportedly causing health concerns and no longer fit the kind of life she actually wanted to be living. The shift became noticeably easier once she had real physical and emotional distance from Los Angeles. During the years she spent living in Michigan, she discovered that many of the old cosmetic habits simply fell away on their own, because the constant pressure that had driven them was no longer sitting directly in front of her every single day. That distance changed far more than just her appearance. It changed the entire way she lived her life. Today, she shares a lovingly restored 14-acre former hunting cabin in upstate New York with Busfield. Far from the red carpets and Beverly Hills routines that once defined her every waking day, she stopped coloring her hair completely and let it turn gray naturally. She left fillers and Botox behind for good. She now says that when she looks in the mirror today, she finally sees herself staring back instead of a performance built for other people's approval. Her daily life reflects that same fundamental shift. She gardens, she cooks, she spends real time outside, away from cameras and casting directors. She no longer measures her own worth against camera angles or online reactions from strangers. In her own words, her wrinkles and sun lines now hold the entire story of everything she has actually lived through. From child stardom, to relentless tabloid scrutiny, to painful divorce, to Hollywood's long, exhausting obsession with youth. And that real, lived story matters far more to her now than any polished artificial surface ever could again. That same pattern of searching, hoping, and slowly rebuilding runs straight through her love life as well, and it's worth understanding fully, because it explains so much about who she eventually became. On February 26, 1988, when she was just 23 years old, Melissa Gilbert married actor Beau Brinkman only 7 weeks after ending her highly publicized, headline-grabbing engagement to Rob Lowe. The timing alone tells you a great deal about exactly where she was emotionally at that point in her life. One storm had barely finished before the next one began rolling in. Then, on May 1st, 1989, she gave birth to their son, Dakota Paul Brinkman, while still working steadily and drinking heavily behind the scenes. She later directly connected that entire period to untreated alcoholism, deep emotional instability, and the crushing pressure of trying to define herself as an adult after Little House on the Prairie had ended. The marriage became tangled in infidelity, substance abuse, and volatile arguments before finally ending in divorce in 1994. When she looks back on those years now, she doesn't describe them with any trace of nostalgia. She describes them plainly and honestly as chaotic and deeply self-destructive. Her second marriage began with a very different kind of hope attached to it. On January 1st, 1995, she married actor Bruce Boxleitner after a difficult courtship that had already gone through painful shifts and real uncertainty, including a broken engagement she reportedly only learned the full truth about through his ex-wife. Later that same year, on October 6, 1995, they welcomed their son, Michael Garrett Boxleitner, deliberately named after Michael Landon, the man who had meant so much to Melissa as a father figure during her formative years. That detail matters because it reveals exactly how much emotional weight she had placed on this particular relationship. She wanted real stability. She wanted genuine protection. She wanted a home that finally felt safe after everything that had come before it. And yet, even inside that second marriage, old patterns from her past stayed painfully alive underneath the surface. Gilbert later admitted that she kept chasing emotional security wherever she could find it, kept drinking to cope with feelings she couldn't otherwise process, and kept quietly holding on to the hope that Bruce would somehow rescue her from a loneliness that had followed her since childhood. After 16 years together, they separated quietly in 2010 and finalized their divorce in 2011, closing a long chapter of her life that she now sees clearly as being driven far more by fear than by any real, lasting peace. Then came something that felt genuinely different from the very beginning, right from the first conversation. In 2012, Gilbert, then 47 years old, walked into a bar in Los Angeles and sat down at the counter, right next to Timothy Busfield, 55, who happened to be having pizza that night. He had reportedly been out of the dating scene for 8 months at that point. She was still quietly rebuilding her life after her second divorce. Both of them had lived long, complicated, deeply public lives already. Both had children from earlier marriages. Both were carrying years of private damage behind familiar, recognizable television faces that millions of Americans thought they already knew. And yet, when they actually started talking that night, the energy between them was calm, almost effortless. There were no games being played, no frantic rush towards something serious, no performance for an audience. Just two people who had already been through more than enough in life to instantly recognize what real steadiness actually felt like when they finally found it. That calm connection moved quickly into real commitment. By December 2012, less than a full year after they first met at that bar, Busfield proposed to her during the holiday season, and their engagement was publicly confirmed in early January 2013. On April 24, 2013, they were married in a small private ceremony at Rancho San Isidro in Santa Barbara. The setting carried the warm glow of old Hollywood romance, and Gilbert added her own deliberate statement to the day by wearing a red dress instead of traditional white. It was a choice that fit the entire moment perfectly, because this was never meant to be a story about innocence or a fresh start from nothing. It was a story about hard-won experience, genuine survival, and one more real chance at building something honest, after everything both of them had already lived through separately. For people who had watched her go through 2 painful divorces in public view, the image of her standing in red at that quiet, private ranch wedding felt like real proof that grown-up love could still arrive, even after years of disappointment. After the wedding, she and Busfield deliberately moved away from Los Angeles and built a life that felt intentionally smaller, quieter, and far calmer than anything either of them had known before. First they settled in Michigan, then later fully embraced a more rustic, grounded life that Gilbert shared openly through books, interviews, and social media. She wrote about gardening, about raising chickens, about simple daily routines, and about the deep appeal of building a home away from the noise that had shaped so much of her earlier life in the public eye. Together, they came to represent a certain kind of late-life reinvention that resonated with millions of people watching from the outside. They were creative. They were outspoken. They looked genuinely settled in a way that felt earned rather than performed. Their story gave people watching a real sense that even after pain, scandal, repeated divorce, and relentless public scrutiny, a peaceful, honest third act was still fully possible for anyone willing to fight for it. And then, in a way almost nobody expected, that entire image was shaken to its foundation. In January 2026, Busfield was arrested in New Mexico after 2 11-year-old twin boys from the set of the Fox drama The Cleaning Lady allegedly accused him of sexual abuse. Weeks later, a grand jury indictment reportedly followed, and older claims dating back to the 1990s and the 2010s allegedly resurfaced alongside the new accusations. For fans who had spent years genuinely invested in the idea of a quiet, rustic fairy tale ending, this news landed like a gut punch. Gilbert, by then decades removed from the innocent role that had first made her famous as a child, chose to stand publicly beside her husband as he faced multiple serious child abuse-related counts. And the story that once looked so peacefully settled suddenly, violently became one of the darkest turns of her entire public life. It's important to be precise here about exactly what has actually been alleged, because this part of the story involves serious, real, and still unresolved legal proceedings that no court has yet decided. According to reports, in early February 2026, a Bernalillo County grand jury in Albuquerque indicted 68-year-old Timothy Busfield on 4 counts of criminal sexual contact with a minor, tied to work he had reportedly done on the cleaning lady between November 2022 and spring 2024. Prosecutors allegedly claimed that he inappropriately touched one twin boy over the child's clothing, first when the boy was 7 and again when he was 8, while the boy's 11-year-old twin also separately reported abuse. The arrest warrant issued on January 9, 2026 additionally referenced an earlier, unproven allegation involving a 16-year-old girl during an audition at the Sacramento Street Theater, a venue Busfield had co-founded years earlier. He has pleaded not guilty to all charges and recorded a video publicly calling the accusations all lies, even as authorities reportedly described what they characterized as a pattern of alleged misconduct spanning multiple years and more than one project. As of this reporting, Busfield remains free pending a jury trial that is tentatively scheduled for May 2027, and every charge described here remains, at this stage, only an allegation that a court has not yet resolved. When Gilbert finally addressed the case publicly on Good Morning America in early April 2026, roughly 2 months after the indictment came down, she delivered a defense that left no real room for ambiguity about exactly where she stood. Looking directly into the camera, she said Busfield was, in her own words, the last person in the world who would ever hurt a child, and added that she trusted him completely with her own children's lives. She had already used similar language in earlier written statements, but saying it out loud on national television reportedly gave those words an entirely different weight and permanence. She explained that lawyers had actually advised her for weeks to remain silent throughout the process, and yet, she had deliberately chosen that specific moment to make unmistakably clear that she personally believed the allegations against her husband were false. The public response divided almost instantly. Some viewers saw unwavering, admirable loyalty in the face of devastating circumstances. Others saw flat refusal to even entertain the possibility that something had gone terribly wrong. In a preview clip released ahead of the full interview, Gilbert described the entire case as the most traumatizing experience of their combined lives. She spoke about Busfield's arrest on January 13, 2026, as the exact moment everything around them changed, all at once. Finances, friendships, long-term plans, and steady work all seemed to collapse simultaneously in the days that followed. Sitting beside her husband during the interview, she said their life as they had known it was, in her word, done. And she spoke openly about grieving an entire future they had believed they were carefully building together. Her language throughout carried the unmistakable heaviness of real loss, even while the underlying legal case remained completely unresolved and ongoing. Gilbert made it clear in that interview that what frightened her most wasn't only the possibility of an eventual conviction down the line. It was also the certain knowledge that their shared future together had already been damaged in ways that felt permanent and beyond repair, regardless of how the legal process ultimately concludes. Projects planned under their shared Modern Prairie banner reportedly now face real uncertainty because potential business partners no longer want their own names publicly linked to Busfield in any capacity. Even the moment of his temporary release from custody carried its own heavy shadow. In January 2026, a judge released him on his own recognizance after about a week in jail, and around 70 separate support letters were reportedly filed on his behalf, arguing that he should not remain behind bars while awaiting trial. And yet, none of that legal relief actually restored anything resembling normal life for either of them. Gilbert described the months following his arrest as a permanent, unrelenting storm, where every single phone call carried the possibility of announcing another vanished opportunity, or another person quietly stepping back from their lives for good. What gave her public defense its sharpest, most unsettling edge was the fact that she openly acknowledged the very real public cost of these allegations, even while simultaneously insisting on his complete innocence. She said plainly, in her own words, that for Tim, professionally speaking, it was already done. He was, in her exact phrase, canceled. And she went even further, saying that even if he were eventually fully exonerated in court, he would always, in the eyes of many people, remain that guy. In other words, she genuinely believed the accusation itself had permanently attached itself to his name and reputation in a way that no future verdict, however it ultimately comes down, could ever fully erase. That specific admission is exactly what made her public stance so unsettling to so many people watching. She was standing firmly beside him with complete personal conviction, while simultaneously admitting out loud that the wider world had, in her own assessment, already made up its mind about him, regardless of what any jury eventually decides. Alongside these devastating public battles, Gilbert has also been quietly dealing with years of serious physical pain that most fans never fully understood the scope of. In March 2012, at 47 years old, she joined season 14 of Dancing with the Stars, paired with professional dancer Maxim Chmerkovskiy, performing live each week in front of an ABC television audience of roughly 18 million viewers. Then, on April 9, 2012, during a Paso Doble routine set to a Kiss medley, she fell hard and struck her head directly on the dance floor. Remarkably, she still finished the entire routine before being quietly escorted from the studio by ambulance. Doctors ultimately diagnosed a concussion along with whiplash, adding to significant neck trauma that had already been building for years beneath the surface. Even after missing the following live results show entirely, she returned to competition and ultimately finished the season in 5th place. That single injury fit into a much longer, more painful history of spinal problems that had quietly shaped years of her life. Around 2010, a serious back injury triggered more than a decade of chronic pain, stacked directly on top of lingering effects from an earlier broken back in 2001 and a spinal fusion surgery performed in 2010. By 2019, she was publicly describing constant nerve pain that radiated from her neck down into her arms, accompanied by numbness and persistent headaches that disrupted her sleep and made even simple, everyday movement genuinely difficult. Then, in November 2020, at 56 years old, she underwent major surgery to remove old surgical hardware and repair deteriorating discs in her neck, in the hope of finally halting progressive nerve damage that had been building for nearly 2 decades. Even ordinary daily life brought its own fresh, frightening scares along the way. In June 2023, at her cabin in the Catskills, Gilbert noticed what initially seemed like an entirely ordinary insect bite on her left arm. Within 24 hours, it had swollen dramatically and developed visible red-streaking, classic textbook warning signs of a rapidly spreading infection. By the time she reached the emergency room, she had already developed a fever. Doctors diagnosed cellulitis, with an abscess actively forming underneath the skin. They marked the visible spread of the infection directly on her arm with a pen to track its progression, started her immediately on intravenous antibiotics, and warned her plainly that without prompt treatment, the infection could have entered her bloodstream within a matter of days. Then there was a struggle Gilbert had quietly carried for almost her entire life without ever fully understanding what it actually was. In 2024, at 60 years old, Gilbert finally learned the real name for something that had affected her since her earliest years on the Little House on the Prairie set. It was misophonia, a genuine neurological disorder that causes extreme, involuntary reactions to certain everyday sounds. She has described being a child on set back in the mid-1970s, sitting through classroom scenes while other kids around her chewed gum or tapped their fingernails against wooden desks, and feeling her entire body flood with sudden, overwhelming distress. Her face would turn red. She would fight down the powerful urge to scream, or simply run away from the room entirely. For decades, she genuinely assumed this meant there was something deeply wrong with her own personality. She thought she was simply mean. She thought she was fundamentally unstable, and she carried that private shame in complete silence for most of her life. Finally, learning that her experience had an actual clinical name gave real shape to something she had spent years desperately trying to hide from everyone around her. She only discovered that effective treatment even existed in 2023 when she reached out directly to Duke University's Center for Misophonia and Emotion Regulation and wrote a simple, honest message asking for help. The center's director, Dr. Zach Rosenthal, told her plainly that real help existed and that she was not alone in what she had been experiencing. She went through 16 full weeks of intensive cognitive behavioral therapy, learning how to recognize the earliest warning signs building inside her own body, including small physical reactions like her feet involuntarily clenching just before panic fully took over. Then, in 2024, she began speaking publicly about the condition for the first time, working directly with Duke University and various media outlets to push for greater public awareness and increased research funding. All of this together has shaped the version of Melissa Gilbert that people actually see today. She did not simply grow older while staying inside Hollywood's familiar system. She deliberately left the exact place that had taught her to fear aging in the first place, and then rebuilt an entirely new life somewhere she could finally breathe freely. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, she had fully stepped away from her old public image. The dyed red hair was gone, the fillers were gone, the frozen, over-treated forehead was gone. Around 2013, after marrying Busfield that April, she left Los Angeles first for rural Michigan, and later for that restored 14-acre cabin in the Catskills that would eventually become her true home. She has said clearly, on multiple occasions, that she genuinely had to get out of Los Angeles in order to age in any real, honest way, because the city itself simply did not feel safe for that natural process to happen. That idea eventually became part of her professional work as well. In 2022, more than 45 years after her original Little House debut back in 1974, Gilbert launched Modern Prairie, a lifestyle brand and online community built specifically for women over 50. That particular choice mattered deeply because the audience itself was the entire point of the project. She was no longer trying desperately to stay appealing to a youth-obsessed entertainment industry that had shaped so much of her early life. She was speaking directly and honestly to women who had lived enough of their own lives to genuinely understand exactly what she meant. She began appearing on camera with little makeup, or sometimes none at all. She talked openly about menopause, about hot flashes, about sagging skin, and about the full range of ordinary body changes that most public figures spend careers hiding. She connected the entire brand directly to her own daily routines as well, drawing on gardening, simple home cooking, and the lived reality of restoring a small cabin that she and Busfield had spent years working on together. Around 2022 and 2023, she began speaking with more genuine confidence than ever before about aging itself, describing menopause and growing older as gifts she no longer wanted to hide from anyone. When she turned 60 in May 2024, she publicly called it the most incredible year of her life, and said she had personally earned every single line, every scar, and every hard-won opinion that had come along with it. The underlying message was unmistakably clear. She no longer saw older women as faded, diminished versions of who they used to be. She saw them instead as visible, creative, sexual, and fully, completely alive. She even said publicly that moving through menopause had actually deepened her marriage because she finally felt more completely herself than she ever had before in her adult life. That same hard-won honesty shaped the acting work she chose to take on as well. Even after leaving Los Angeles behind for good, she never actually stopped acting entirely. She simply stopped trying to force herself into younger, more marketable versions of who she used to be. In the off-Broadway play Still, which opened in New York in the mid-2020s, she played a woman in her mid-60s confronting a romance from 30 years earlier in her life. Acting directly opposite Mark Moses on stage, she used the role to touch something genuinely close to her own real experiences, including the long, complicated emotional trail of marriages and divorces she had actually lived through herself. She said publicly that taking on age-appropriate roles like this one felt far more genuinely radical in modern entertainment than simply pretending to still be 40 years old. Her health remained a visible, honest part of that same public journey as well. After nearly 20 years of chronic neck and back pain, she underwent major spinal surgery in November 2020 and later updated fans that she felt really good just 3 weeks afterward, a small but meaningful victory after 2 decades of pain. Then, in her early 60s, she shared another deeply personal health milestone by revealing that she was officially cancer-free at 62 years old. She paired that enormous personal relief with real activism, working in December 2025 with the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network in direct honor of Michael Landon, the man who had shaped so much of her childhood and who had died of pancreatic cancer at just 54 years old back in 1991. When you actually step back and look at the full arc of Melissa Gilbert's life, from a 9-year-old girl beating 500 other children for one of the most iconic roles in television history, to a woman standing beside her husband through allegations that have not yet been resolved by any court, to someone who finally learned the real name for a condition she had silently carried since childhood, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. The sweet, simple prairie girl America thought it knew for 9 straight seasons was never actually the full story at all. It was always just the visible surface. Underneath it was a woman who spent an entire lifetime fighting to separate who she really was from who the world desperately wanted her to be, and who is still, even now in her 60s, working through what that separation actually costs.